Welcome to the Outlaw Radio Show, the recording of the radio show. You guys know the routine, but in case this is your first time watching, the Outlaw Radio Show is just that. It is a radio show. We are nationally syndicated on radio stations across America. Every week, I get in the studio with my microphone and I record an episode. I send that audio to His Productions, Josh Brown and their wonderful crew. They take that, produce it for radio. They send it out to the radio partners. I re-download it. We put it all back together and podcast it. What we thought would be fun is to actually record, live stream the recording of the show. And that's what you're watching. So I am actually about to record an episode of the Outlaw Radio Show. And you just get to join me via our live stream. I am joined, as always, kind of our video producer, Creighton Vaughn. Creighton, how are you doing, man?
I am doing very well, and I absolutely love the term video producer.
Video producer,
quite a bit.
Video producer is kind of a whole new thing. Like you're the, in addition to managing the live stream and interacting with me, you're kind of the resident gatekeeper audience member. So as you're watching, if you have any questions or comments or want to any feedback, you can on Facebook or YouTube. Just comment in the comment section. Creighton is monitoring those things. And between each block of audio, Creighton will kind of bring up certain points that you make or questions that you might have, and we can interact in real time here on the internet, which is very, very cool. How was your day, man?
It was pretty good. It was very long. As I think I've said before, I'm working to set up for a new store, and it's kicking my butt, not gonna lie.
I gotta tell you, I'm liking the shaved head. It's a really good look for you.
I agree. I actually just today I got a nice compliment about how I have a very nice shaped head.
That compliment was not from any type of a female. It was from Chad Mosley, who said that you had a.
Hey, he's a very pretty man, though.
he said, and I quote, "You have the perfect head for that," which I don't know if is a compliment per se.
It is absolutely a compliment because it has the word perfect in it. I don't understand the I don't know. It's perfect.
I don't know either. Well, again, there's 4 blocks of audio. We're going to dive right into the show in just a second. Tomorrow's kind of a trippy day for me. Just a few minutes ago, we wrapped up at the house. My youngest, my daughter, Mabel, is she's 2 tomorrow. And Creighton, you've been with me for a long time. You've been around with all of my kids being born. It's crazy to think that Mabel is turning 2 tomorrow.
Yeah, it is. Time really flies. I mean, it seems like just yesterday we were at a youth event and you were telling me that Jessica was pregnant with Quincy, and now your third is 2.
And now there's a third. What is a crazy thought, and this hit me while we were doing the birthday party, is that she will have spent almost half of her life in a pandemic. Like, she only cognitively knows this very foreign existence, foreign life, but that's completely normal. Like, she's going to grow up like masks being like, why aren't you wearing a mask? That seems just strange that you're not. What are you doing? Like, we don't go to school. We don't go outside. Like, it's just a weird thing to think that like half of her life has been in quarantine.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's going to be some very interesting generational consequences here, both for people who were like in elementary, middle, high school during the pandemic and those born just before and during the pandemic. It'll be very interesting to watch.
It will be strange. So I got quite ahead with my Bible study for Sunday. And so today was kind of a wide open day. Really wasn't sure what my workflow was going to look like. And this morning I woke up, was getting ready for the day, and I had just a thought of what I wanted to spend tonight's episode talking about. And I know some of you might initially cringe because of what all's going on in the news, but I want to talk about voting tonight. That's the subject matter. I don't want to dive into the weeds about, recounts and all the things that are happening. I want to look at voting more from a macro perspective, and hopefully by the end of the radio show, kind of hone it into some very specific applications, not just for all of us as Americans or concerned citizens, but also as Christians. And so that's going to kind of be the subject matter of the episode. You ready for this?
I am.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead.
Absolutely.
I'm going to start rolling some music here, and the first block here is 14 minutes. You ready?
Good to go.
3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Outlaw Radio Show. My name is Zach Adams, and I pastor a church located just outside of Athens, Georgia. The name of the church is Calvary 316. It's typically at this point in the radio show, I give you all types of contact information, invite you to come if you're local to be our in-person guest one Sunday or to watch us online. I'm going to kind of forgo all of that and just say, learn about the church if you're interested by visiting Calvary 316. .tv. I'll also add that wherever you're listening or however you're listening, we're glad you're listening. If you're watching on YouTube, we live stream the recording of the Outlaw Radio Show every Wednesday night at 8:00. And so if you haven't explored that, we live stream on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/The Radio Outlaw, as well as our YouTube page, which is outlawradio.live, so very easy to find. And so if you haven't explored that, if you're listening on the radio or on the podcast, join us one night, 8:00 Wednesdays, and watch the recording of the Outlaw Radio Show. The reason that I am speeding through my normal bit is I have an awful lot that I want to talk about today, and I don't want to waste any time getting to it. Voting. Now, I know that I mentioned that word with the backdrop of everything going on in our culture, and that might alarm some of you. I am not going to take this episode and talk about voter fraud. I don't want to talk about all the specific allegations of voter fraud. I don't want to talk about Donald Trump. I don't want to talk about Joe Biden and all of that context. I want to talk about voting in America and more of the macro sense, and then hopefully by the end of the episode, kind of whittle this down to some really specific applications. So I want to start with kind of just a question that I want you, the audience member, to think about. When you think about the American experiment, like, why has the American experiment, really the American Revolution, worked? Why has it survived when we've seen so many other attempts fail. For example, the French Revolution, a similar march towards freedom that didn't last very long. Like, why has the American experiment worked? Why has it survived as long as it has? I think it's Thomas Jefferson that once said that revolutions need to happen every 200 years, just to kind of reset things. But that hasn't happened in America, and I'm personally very grateful for that. We've been a beacon into the world because of our stability. So why have we been so stable? And the answer to me is very, very simple. Our revolutions, like, we have revolutions, but our revolutions take place every 4 years at the ballot box, where our vote is cast, and then there is 2 months later a peaceful transition of power. There's a revolution. One philosophy, one way of doing governance, a set of policies takes over for those that were already in place. Like, we have a revolution every 4 years. And instead of it being through guns and riots and conflict, like, citizen power in the American experiment is exerted over our government through our vote. And that's what I want to talk about today. Within the context of the English monarchy that we revolted against and the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson wrote the following. He said, quote, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. As such, the founding fathers believed and placed the concept of the vote as being a central component of our representative government." Like, the entire experiment of the United States has always been predicated on one simple notion, and that is the notion of self-rule. This idea that people, the citizens, are the best determiners of the structures, the policies that should shape their culture and society, along with a complex system of checks and balances, which I've talked about frequently on this show, as well as founding documents that we kind of always revert back to. Voting. The vote is the essential tool whereby citizens are able to enact the ideal form of governments they want for themselves. That we can set up a government by the people and specifically for the people. But the vote matters. I bring this up because to any of those who, especially with this current political climate, might argue that we shouldn't be, even as Christians, concerned with what we're watching play out in front of us, what we're seeing happen in our political world. For those that argue such a point, you underestimate the significance, the vital importance that the vote has to the American experiment. Like, without confidence in a safe and fair election, without the ability that my vote matters, America has dark days ahead of her. Now, let me begin by just generally discussing how the vote works in our system. Now, one of the beautiful things about America is that the framers of the Constitution actually left the details as well as the mechanisms of voting to the individual states. The federal government decided when it came to voting, they were going to by and large stay out of it. In Article 1, Section 4, this is what the Constitution says. Quote, "The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislator thereof. But the Congress may, at any time by law, make or alter such regulations." You see, while the federal government can legally change, and they have the authority to change the principles, and they have the ability to alter, in certain instances, the parameters of who's allowed to vote, the state legislators in our system are charged with the constitutional prerogative and responsibility to determine the process of our vote. While most of our elected officials are relegated to the functions of each state in the union. So most of our votes are state specific. For example, like we vote on which two senators we want to send to represent our states' rights, to defend our states. And we also vote on local congressmen and women who then we send to the House of Representatives to reflect our wishes as local communities. But the office of the presidency, well, that's very unique because it's not state specific. As the chief, the commander-in-chief of the executive branch of the United States government, this is the office of president is the only position in our entire framework that intentionally is designed to represent the entire country. One of the things, if you've been following this presidential election, Joe Biden has repeatedly said on the stump, I mean, over and over and over again, he'll say, though I'm a Democratic candidate, I'll be an American president. And every time I hear him say that, I'm like, yeah, no, duh. Like, that's the job of president. Like, you are the one position where it's not about party, it's not about state, it's about the federal government. There's no way you can be president and not be an American president. You govern all of us. That's why the position's so important. And now it's because the president is different from all the other positions. Regarding the election of this person who fills this role, the Founding Fathers established in Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution what is known, and you've heard this, as the Electoral College, in order to provide a last fail-safe to keep our country from really going the way of France and putting in a monarch. The people, and please understand this, the people in our system do not actually elect the president. That is not how the Constitution is set up. Instead, our vote, the vote you cast and the vote I cast, only mandates who we want within our state system to be our various electors who then choose the president. Like in the Electoral College, votes are divided the following way. And this really got me interested today. I was like, I know the larger way that the Electoral College votes, but like how does each state get determined this specific number? It's actually very simple. Like every state in America, all 50, begins with 2 Electoral College votes. And those 2 votes are for the senators. So you have 2 senators, you get 2 votes. But then you're awarded a vote for each of the representatives you have in Congress. Now, since the number of congressional representatives varies from state to state, depending on population, that's how the House of Representatives works. Like California, this big state with a lot of representatives, has more electoral college votes than, let's say, a smaller, less populated state like Nevada. Like in my state, the state of Georgia, we have 16 electoral college votes. We have 2 senators and 14 representatives. And really what makes the brilliance of this is that in the end, at least theoretically, everyone's vote, because of the way the Electoral College's balance is divvied up by state population, every vote for president is weighted the same. If a candidate wins the popular vote in a state, in accordance with whatever those state election laws mandated, they win, accordingly, the sum total of the Electoral College votes of that state. So if you win the state of Georgia, the majority of the vote in the state of Georgia, then you get all 16 Electoral College votes. The only exception to this, by the way, is Nebraska and Maine, who actually divide their electoral votes proportionately. Today, in order to win the presidency, as we've seen play out, a candidate needs a majority of 270 electoral votes out of a possible 538, or one more than the 50% mark of 269. Now, as we've seen in 2000, as well as in 2016, it is possible to win the popular vote, but then lose the presidential election if the candidate doesn't win enough electoral votes. And the challenge to that is that the census determines the number of representatives based upon each state, determining the number of electoral college votes. But then we only do a census every 10 years, which is sometimes why you find a disparaging between the popular vote and the electoral college. In fact, people want to say, well, in 2000 and 2016, that, this has happened. It's never happened before. That's not true. This has happened 3 other times in our history where someone wins the popular vote, but then loses the electoral college and therefore the election. We saw this happen in 1824. We've seen this happen in 1876, and we've seen this happen in 1888, in addition to 2000 and 2016. Furthermore, only 29 states actually have laws on the books that require the elector to vote according to the wishes of the person, the state that they're representing. In fact, 21 states have a setup where the electors, in theory, can vote really for whoever they wish. Now, this year, 2020, the Supreme Court did vote on a case that mandated or allowed states to have the power to enact requirements on how electors vote. So we'll see this change. But historically, 99% of the electors have voted as pledged. In 2016, though, 7 out of the 538 electors failed to pledge their vote. And this blew my mind. In Texas, 1 Republican voted for John Kasich, the other for the Libertarian Ron Paul. Surprisingly, 5 abandoned Hillary Clinton, 1 in Hawaii for Bernie Sanders, 4 in the state of Washington, 3 for Colin Powell, and 1 for Faith Spotted Eagle. So this has happened. Now, we're going to build on this. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with the Outlaw Radio Show.
So just to make sure that I understood that right, and just so to make sure that everyone, you're telling me that there are people who their state told them vote for X candidate, and they were like, nah.
Yes. Again, 21 states have no laws prohibiting it. And in
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard.
And in those states, now again, historically, it's been just the tradition that, 99% of all of the electoral college votes from the very beginning have voted as pledged, right? Always have. But in 2016, so if you see any electoral college map from 2016 that doesn't include the names John Kasich, Ron Paul, I might have said Rand Paul, but Ron Paul, the Libertarian, Bernie Sanders, Colin Powell, and Faith Spotted Eagle.
What is a Faith Spotted Eagle?
It is a woman that's in charge of, I think, like the Navajo Nation.
Oh.
So like the actual totals that you see aren't correct. Now, that's how the states determine that, but that's not actually what happened with the Electoral College vote. 2 Republicans defected, 5 bailed on Hillary Clinton, which to me kind of blows my mind. So
yeah, no, that's crazy. I didn't know, I knew theoretically that they could do that. I didn't know that it actually happened, or that it happened 4 years ago.
Okay.
Which is hilarious given where we are today, which you can get back to.
If
now.
you think any of that's interesting, just hold on. Next block's 12 minutes. You ready?
Yep.
3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Outlaw Radio Show. I'm talking about voting. This electoral college system. It's pretty crazy. The second point that I want to make, really in light of everything that's going on currently, is that while our voting system is really revolutionary, like there's been nothing like it in the history of the world, it's simply a reality of our history that this electoral college system, like the way that we vote, has had its fair share of growing pains. Like since our founding, and I did some research today, but since our founding, we've had 4 significant crises related to the Electoral College. And I want to go through them kind of systematically here. Almost immediately after Washington's 2 terms, as well as his vice president, John Adams's 1 term as president, in 1800, so we're talking about really early on in our history, we had our first kind of constitutional crisis. Like in the beginning, the electors, the Electoral College, the electors casted their votes. They actually casted 2. They casted for candidates, but they didn't designate whether they were voting for the president or the vice president. So they casted one vote, but they didn't determine if this was president or vice president. Now, the way it was all set up, and this is kind of really strange, especially from our perspective, is that whoever won the Electoral College would be president. Whoever lost would be the vice president. So imagine a dynamic where Donald Trump in 2016 is president and Hillary Clinton is his vice president. That was kind of the setup. In fact, John Adams is his term. So the third term of the presidency, the third block of 4 years, Adams, he won the presidency, but the entire 4 years he was in office, he was frustrated because his vice president, who lost, was completely contrarian, fought against him. His name had to be Thomas Jefferson. Now, the obvious flaw in all of this became exacerbated when during the contentious 1800 election, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who were both running mates of the same party, they ended up both receiving 73 Electoral College votes. They split the vote. Now, according to the Constitution, in such a situation, it was left to the House of Representatives to break the tie. What do? Jefferson and Burr split the vote. Within the House of Representatives, there was 36 rounds of voting until Jefferson finally won, became president, and Aaron Burr his vice president. And now, because of this, in 1804, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, making it sure that electors had to now designate their votes for president and vice president. Additionally, while the 12th Amendment left in place kind of the tie-breaking system by which the House of Representatives would decide the president, it also stipulated that it would be the Senate, it would be their job to break a tie concerning the vice president. And the reason that they did this is that in case the House ended up being deadlocked past Inauguration Day, the Senate could circumvent them, nominate a vice president who would then immediately become president. Like in modern times, this is largely avoided because the president and the vice president are from the same party and now run on a joint ticket. So that was the first crisis that had to get cleared up. The second crisis in our system rose during the 1824 presidential election. And I'm sure all of you listening are very aware of the nuances of the 1824 presidential election. But let me recap it for you in case you're not. There were four men. Four men were running. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. They were all on the ballot. By the way, they all came from the same party. At the time, it was the Democratic Republican Party. Now, John C. Calhoun easily won the vice presidential election. But since none of these four men were able to win a majority in the Electoral College necessary to be president, for the first time, the decision was actually left to the House of Representatives to figure out who the president would be. Now, this is amazing. But in the end, Andrew Jackson would win a plurality of both the popular and the Electoral College vote. He would carry 151,271 of the popular vote and 99 Electoral College votes. But John Quincy Adams, who only had 113,122 votes and 84 Electoral College votes, he would be nominated by the House as the 10th president. So we had a moment where the president of the United States not just lost the popular vote, but also lost the Electoral College. Now, this was a mess. And as a result, the 1824 election would lead the Congress to end this congressional caucus system, which was a mess. It was used for nominating candidates. And in the end, the big legacy is that it would force the development of the two-party system in the United States. It's why we don't have four candidates from major parties on the ballot. It simplified it to avoid these type of problems. Now, the third crisis would arise during the presidential election of 1876. Now, in 1876, we were right in the midst. The Civil War has ended. We're in the midst of a disaster that's known as Reconstruction. The nation goes to the polls seeking to elect a successor for the Republican Ulysses S. Grant. Now, as the vote was tallied, the Democratic candidate and governor of New York, Samuel Tilden, emerged with an amazing lead of more than 260,000 popular votes. But there was a problem. You see, Tilden had only amassed 184 electoral votes, which was literally one vote shy of the number needed to defeat his Republican opponent, the governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, to compound the problem, vote totals from 3 southern states, and again, this is right after the Civil War, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, were in complete dispute. Like, both sides were claiming massive voter fraud. Like, together, these 3 states represented 19 electoral college votes, which, along with one other disputed elector from Oregon, which is another story in of itself, would be enough to swing the election either way. What happened? You had chaos, you had recounts, you had discounted ballots, you had accusations of tampering. All of these things ensued. No one knew who won. Sound familiar? Now, while the Constitution made provisions for what to do in an electoral tie, the House of Representatives would make the decision. Interestingly enough, the Constitution gave no counsel for how to handle a disputed result. Like, Congress would have to figure out what to do because the Constitution didn't say. And yet the problem with this is that the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives and would have sided with Tilden. The Republicans dominated the Senate and would have sided with Hayes. The compromise was that a bipartisan electoral commission, you've heard that phrase, the Electoral Commission, they were charged to make the decision. Now, this commission was to be fair. So it was comprised of 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent, who could break a tie. This independent was the Supreme Court Justice, David Davis. Now, they get into the midst, they start working through the weeds, and then this is what happens. Justice David Davis ends up dropping off the commission because he's offered a Republican Senate seat from his home state of Illinois. So he leaves the commission, resigns from the Supreme Court, and becomes a senator. What does that leave us? It leaves us now with this commission charged with solving the problem, having an even number of votes, breaking strictly along party lines. There was no remedy in sight. Now, behind the scenes, the party leaders ended up hashing out what would become known as the Compromise of 1877. Like, if elected, the Republican Hayes, he would agree to cede control of the South back to local Democrat municipalities. Like, he would limit the federal intervention, which was so fraught with things because of the reconciliation and all of these things. Hayes would also agree to place a Southerner in his presidential cabinet. So that's what he would do. On the flip side, the Democrats would agree to respect the civil rights of Black citizens, and they would agree to not dispute Hayes's election. So that was the grand compromise of 1877. Now, what's amazing about that is, despite the fact that Samuel Tilden likely won the popular vote, his own party railroaded him, and the Presidential Commission awarded Hayes all 3 of the contested states in early March of 1877, making him the winner by a single electoral vote, 184 to 185. So again, we have seen crazier days. Now, when we come back to the show, we're going to talk about the final crisis, which has actually happened more recently in 2000. But before we do, I want to just very quickly let you know, the listening audience, that we love feedback. We love to hear from you, those that are listening. We love to hear comments and criticisms, sometimes testimonials. Recently, we've just gotten some wonderful feedback about how the Lord's using this show. as a voice of clarity and in a time of uncertainty. To reach out to us, I just want to just quickly give you some contact information. All contact information you can find from our website, which is outlawradio.org. The easy way to reach us is our email address, which is info@outlawradio.org. We're also on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/The Radio Outlaw. Like us, follow us there, interact with us. You can watch the live stream recording of the show from our Facebook page. Our Twitter handle is @radio_outlaw. My Twitter handle is @Zach, ZACH _Adams. Our YouTube channel is outlawradio.live. And as always, our show is podcasted in its entirety on Apple, Google, Spotify. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to the Outlaw Radio Show.
This is a fascinating episode for me because I was the kid in high school who was good enough at history that he could answer the questions, but 6 months after we left a module or whatever, I knew nothing about anything we were talking about. So this is fascinating. And I was thinking as you were going through it, so we have the two big scandals in the 1800s, and then we have two in the 2000s. And I was like, what happened between them? And then I remembered that there were other scandals, just not directly election related. Well, it's not like we had 200 years of perfect peace or anything, right?
Well, one of the things that we're going to get to in the next block is we're going to kind of, once I kind of go through the crisis, these constitutional crises, I'm going to actually talk about the vote and how the vote has evolved. We think about and we hear, especially in light of what's going on, the pundits talk about and kind of hail the vote as this pure white, pristine idea that we've always had and we've always held sacred, and we've got to fight to the end, and yet it hasn't been that way historically. So we're going to get into that too. I happen to be the kid that I loved history, and I soaked up history, retained history. I think it's one of the reasons that I love the Bible, because the Bible is a lot of history, and I just tend to remember those things. But even as a history buff, they don't go through any of this in history. So I do hope that if you're watching, that you're finding this to be enlightening, engaging. If you hate history, you probably hate this episode, but I think it's interesting. And we're going to get to a point towards the end of the show where we're going to really bring this all down into some application for what's going on presently. So I've got a lot to cover, not a lot of time. So
let's hit it.
Let's do this. 3 to
11 minutes.
Yes, this block is 11 minutes.
Thank you.
3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Outlaw Radio Show. We're talking about voting, the importance of voting. We're talking about the way our votes are applied to a presidential election, the Electoral College. And while revolutionary as an idea, it's had to evolve. There have been times where we've had problems with the Electoral College. And I went through in the previous block 3 of them. You can go back, you can listen, access our podcast, Apple, Google, Spotify. But I wanted to get to the final crisis because this is really interesting, kind of brings us home. The final crisis to the Electoral College system came more recently in 2000. While initially called for Al Gore, who was the vice president at the time, only to then be later that night switched over to George W. Bush, because the vote in the state of Florida was razor thin and plagued with all kinds of voting irregularities, like the hanging chads and the scantrons and whatnot. Gore, to his constitutional prerogative, demanded there be a recount. It all came down to Florida, and the votes were thin. Now, because Florida state law determined that all presidential recounts, all voting recounts, had to be done by the state's official deadline to cast their Electoral College votes, it made the recount difficult. You didn't have a lot of time to do it. So that was the Florida state law. Gore wanted a recount, but the Florida state law was like, there's only a small window to do this. Now, because of that, the Florida Supreme Court intervened, overruled, and extended the deadline. So they superseded the state law. Now, that said, because the Constitution is crystal clear that the voting laws of each state must be determined by the legislators of that state, that ruling of the Florida Supreme Court was appealed, taken to the U.S. Supreme Court, which overruled Florida, immediately suspending the recount and enforcing the state's deadline. Like, for the first time in United States history, the Supreme Court of the United States had to actually weigh in and help determine a presidential election. They didn't determine it, but they enforced certain rules and guidelines. Now, Al Gore won the nation's popular vote in 2000, but George W. Bush was declared president-elect on December 13th, a month after the election, by winning the Electoral College, which hadn't happened since 1888. Now, the other thing you need to keep in mind as you process what's going on right now is that while voting is left to the states, there have been occasions when it became 100% necessary for the federal government to get involved. And the Constitution does afford parameters for this. Some things I didn't know about voting. Before the ratification of the Constitution, beginning with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, only white Protestant males over the age of 21 who own land were actually allowed to cast a vote in colonial America. It wasn't one man, one vote. Now, because the Constitution rejected a national standard for voting rights, leaving this to each state to have their own system, in almost most instances, that precedent never changed. Like, in fact, it's estimated that in 1789, our first president, George Washington, ended up being elected with only 6% of the population actually casting a ballot. You had to be white, Protestant, and a landowner over the age of 21. Limits the voting pool. You want to talk about suppression. Now, during the decades of the 1920s, of the 1820s into the 1830s, more and more states are joining the Union. They're all creating their own state constitutions, outlining who's allowed to vote, how the process would occur. I mean, varying in all kinds of crazy ways. A measure of uniformity was needed. In 1856, without federal involvement, the states had changed voting laws, which included not just landowners, but all white males. So if you were a white male and a citizen, you didn't have to be a Protestant anymore, but you could vote. But after the aftermath of the Civil War, and again, the federal government stayed out of voting all the way through the Civil War, it did become necessary for the federal government to make some larger national reforms. In 1866, the 14th Amendment was passed, clarifying once and for all that all male white citizens aged 21 had a legal right to vote. You couldn't take that away. 3 years later, in 1869, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which a lot of people don't talk about the 15th Amendment. Again, 1869, the 15th Amendment granted all men the right to vote regardless of quote, race, color, or if they were formerly slaves. And now, prior to 1870, why this was important is that black men were counted as being 3/5 of a person. Like, the concept, it intended to skew representation and voting and taxation. Sadly, though, while the 15th Amendment led to immediate gains in black representation in our government, there was a vicious backlash in the form of what we know as Jim Crow laws, all designed to disenfranchise blacks from voting. And as you work your way through American history, like, the next significant development regarding voting rights came on the federal level. On August 18th, 1920, we have the passing of the 19th Amendment, which gave all women now, women citizens, the right to vote. On January 23rd, 1964, the Congress would pass the 24th Amendment, outlawing poll taxing, which was a practice often used to discourage poor people and minorities from voting. In 1965, you had the Voting Rights Act, which was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson, which really did nothing more than enforce the 15th Amendment by explicitly stating that obstacles like literacy tests or complicated ballot instructions were against federal law. In 1975, Congress expanded the Voting Rights Act to protect the rights of citizens to vote who didn't speak or read English. On July 1st, 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed by Congress, lowering now the voting age from 21 to 18. Again, before 1971, you couldn't vote unless you were the age of 21, but you had kind of a problem. You see, the nation was really upset that you could send an 18-year-old to war. You could draft an 18-year-old to go fight in Vietnam, and yet that 18-year-old didn't have a say in the matter because he couldn't vote. And so that ended up being remedied. We talk about and we frame voting with such kind of pristine terminologies, but we've had to evolve. Like, we've had to have federal intervention to create level playing fields and greater equality. Now, I should say, as with many other things concerning this great American experiment, the way we have voted evolved over the years. Well, the first 100 years of our existence, voting required casting an in-person ballot. Since many of the men were away from home fighting in the Civil War, for the first time, America actually experimented, President Lincoln, with absentee voting on a massive scale. During the 1864 election, Union soldiers were allowed to cast ballots in camps and field hospitals under the supervision of clerks or state officials that certified their vote. And then after the Civil War ended, the logic remained. States increasingly voted to make it possible for soldiers who were away from home in combat or on duty, allowing them to vote by absentee ballot, to vote by mail. Following World War I, many states began allowing absentee ballots to be made available for non-military, work-related purposes. When your job required you to be away from home on election day, you could request an absentee ballot. In the decades that followed, people who voted by mail generally had to have a specific reason, though, for not being able to vote in person. But that even changed, most notably in 1978, when California became the first to allow voters to apply for an absentee ballot without having to provide a reason or an excuse. Like, for years, I could go on and on, but the state of Oregon has had like a statewide mail-in voting system. It's kind of crazy. In 2020, we probably saw the most aggressive changes in voting policy because of the coronavirus pandemic, when states had to make radical changes to voting procedures. Now, I bring all of these things up in the end to make 4 big points concerning what's happening with regards to the 2020 presidential election. And I want to just pause. I don't want to get started into this. I have 4 points, 4 big ones. Let me just take the opportunity very quickly to reiterate that we have recently been live streaming the recording of the Outlaw Radio Show. So what you're listening, if you're listening on the radio or through the podcast, I sit in the studio, I crank up the machine, I set record, and we rock and roll. The thought is, well, that limits any ability to interact with the audience. So what if we live stream the recording? And so if you're listening to this on the radio or on the podcast, this episode has already been live streamed. And so check out outlawradio.live or facebook.com/the radio outlaw. Watch us, join us. And what's sweet about it is you can leave comments, feedback. We can interact with one another. It's really cool, the technology, what it allows us to do. Creighton joins me. He's our producer for it. Don't go anywhere. We're going to finish all of this up with the Outlaw Radio Show.
All right. So as the producer, I just want to give a quick shout out to our biggest fan, Jennifer. No, not Neil.
Neil touched it.
Today. Neil failed today.
Neil touched it.
Might have been on YouTube.
Jennifer Abbott.
Jennifer. She agrees with us that this is a very interesting topic.
Appreciate that.
She also has a question, and that is, and I quote, "Now, what amendment is it again that allows dead people to vote?"
I heard somebody said that my grandfather always said, I'd vote for a Democrat over my dead body. And this is the first year he voted Democrat.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, Biden, I'll tell you though, I mean, regardless of how you view the polls, Biden has done very, very well in the 100 and older crowd. I mean, he seems to have a really strong appeal to the 120 to 100 age bracket.
Well, that's because he knows all of them.
He knows
like at that point, it's a very small group of people.
He went
to high school with all of them.
He went to high. Great question. Let's finish this out, and hopefully we'll get some more, because I'm going to bring this home. We're it's all wrapping up, so we're going to go with it.
9:15.
9:45.
I was wrong.
All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Outlaw Radio Show. I'm talking about voting, the importance of voting, the history of voting, how we vote, the Electoral College, changes that had to be made, how the Constitution empowers the states, how we've had crisis before that we've had to navigate and work through. And I've spent today going through all of this history to make 4 big points that we're going to close with. First, do not overreact to what's going on. If you have to detox from the news by turning off Fox, do it. It drives me crazy. It really does. One of my pet peeves is when I hear people say, man, politics today has never been more divisive in the history of our country. And I'm like, what a stupid, unhistorical statement. It's ignorant. It doesn't factor in the fact that Aaron Burr, who was a vice president, had to settle his political differences with Alexander Hamilton, who was a secretary of the Treasury, with a duel in the streets to the death. Yeah, things are bad right now and toxic, but we're not dueling in the streets quite yet. So pump the brakes. And that doesn't even begin to factor in the reality that in the mid 1800s, the nation had to fight a war over policy issues. I know things feel bad, but from a historical context, it could be much worse. Throughout our long history, we have had contentious, divisive, controversial presidential elections before. Even ones where votes were contested and serious allegations of fraud were levied. And you know what? We survived. If the system is allowed to work, it's proven to work. So calm down. Secondly, the media, social media networks, the candidates, nor the political establishment, none of them have the constitutional authority or right to declare a winner of a presidential election. In fact, when you study this historically, it is the height of hubris for Fox News or Twitter or Facebook to silence anyone that's out there challenging or asking questions about their election projections. 7 media companies don't pick the president, nor do they call balls and strikes. They actually have no role in deciding anything at all. Constitutionally, I don't know if you're aware, and someone needs to let the Joe Biden campaign know, there isn't a thing called the office of the president-elect. Constitutionally, it doesn't exist. It's fake news. It's made up. It's wrong, in fact, for Joe Biden to assume and act as if he's the president. He doesn't know that. And why? It is the individual states who possess the responsibility in our constitutional republic to collect the votes, to count the votes, to certify the results, and then it's actually up to the electors and the Electoral College to decide who's president. That is the system. You see, Donald Trump, whatever you think of him, has every legal right and standing and precedent to challenge any state's election totals. Additionally, he has the right to legally challenge the way that states have tallied their votes and whether or not they tallied them legally in the context of what state legislators have put into place. Which leads me to my third point. The Constitution is absolutely clear And in 2000, the Supreme Court upheld that the mechanism by which a state facilitates the vote is 100% determined by the legislator of the state. The people, specifically elected by the people. Like, at no point in our history have election laws and procedures for how to collect and count the votes. At no point in our history has that responsibility of making those laws and procedures resided in the Secretary of State or the power of a governor, or for that matter, a state Supreme Court. In 2000, the Supreme Court overruled the Florida Supreme Court overruling Florida election law. And the Supreme Court said resoundingly, that's not your job. You can't do that. The legislators in the state have the responsibility to set laws, and those laws have to be followed. Like, as we've seen demonstrated over the last several months, these men and women, Secretary of States and governors and Supreme Courts in the state level, these men and women, they are not constitutionally allowed to arbitrarily decide to change a voting system just because they want to or feel that maybe it's prudent on account of a public health emergency. This pandemic has caused Americans to let go of a lot of constitutional rights. A lot of them, by the way, that haven't been challenged in the Supreme Court. This one will, and Trump has a case because there's a lot of examples of this taking place. Number 4, our vote as citizens is so important to our republic that we not only need to get this right, but the process by which we do so must be completely transparent and above board. You know, a few days ago, Politico released a poll that said a little more than 70% of Republicans actually believe the election was fraudulent. 70% of 72 million is 50 million people think the election was stolen from them. Another report I read today claimed that only 87% of Democrats actually believe Joe Biden won, and that 77% of Republicans believe Trump has enough votes for a second term. Like, friends, we are in an absolutely dangerous situation. Not only do those who voted for Trump need to believe that their vote actually matters and the system worked, but for the benefit of even Joe Biden. Like, we've already seen what happens when half the country believes an election was interfered with or compromised, i.e., 4 years of Russian interference. If you're like me, I know the last few weeks have been taxing, and I know it's been worrisome. Like, most of us are patriots who believe in free and fair elections. And while we may disagree strongly with Joe Biden and the direction that he and his party want to take our country, I do believe with confidence that we would all accept him as the president as long as we believe and can have confidence that he won fair and square. Like, in our American system, our vote is absolutely sacred. It's why men and women have died defending it. It's why we've sent people into other countries to fight for their rights to cast a ballot. We believe in it. And moving beyond being a citizen of America, as citizens of heaven, like, Jesus told us what? He said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And so many of us did just that when we went to the polls and we casted a ballot accordingly. With what we've seen play out, there is nothing wrong with being skeptical about this election. And I hope your skepticism is alleviated by transparency and openness, that the light shines in the darkness and we can know the truth. So it's okay to be upset. It's okay to be skeptical, as long as, and I leave you with this, you also, at the same time, rest fully in the sovereignty of God. Well, you've been listening to the Outlaw Radio Show. If you liked what you heard, I want to encourage you to contact your local Christian radio station. Tell them that you're thankful that they're carrying Outlaw Radio in your community. If you're listening on the radio, or let's say you're listening on our podcast, every episode's podcasted on Apple, Google, Spotify, take a second and check out outlawradio.live. and subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can watch the show being recorded live 8 o'clock on Wednesday nights. I do mean to say that we'd love to hear from you, the listening audience. Questions, feedbacks, testimonies, critiques, the more the merrier. Our contact information can be found at outlawradio.org. As always, I want to say thank you to DJ Dust and the wonderful music provided for the Outlaw Radio Show, as well as my partner in crime and brother, Mr. Josh Brown, and his staff at his productions. Once again, my name is Zach Adams, and I hope you join me again this time next week for more of the Outlaw Radio Show. And there we have it.
Yeah, that's another one in the books. I thought that was really awesome. Very good.
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time working on this episode. I again woke up this morning. I was like, I want to talk about voting. I don't want to get into the nuances of what I don't know. And the truth is, we don't really know. I mean, there are rumors and accusations, all kinds of things, and there's some data to validate it.
Right, but everything that could be said at this point has been said. Like, it could be anything that has ever been, could be happening.
And why jump the gun by talking about things that we would hope over the next few weeks we will gain a lot more clarity about, and we can discuss them when we have more confidence we actually know what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think it was a really cool. I did not know that that Bush wasn't announced until what'd you say, December of before he was
December
inaugurated?
13th.
That's insane. I didn't know that. I always thought that you knew. I always thought.
Well,
I didn't know that we had presidents until like 2 years ago.
Well,
that's a bit of sarcasm. It's a bit of sarcasm.
That really wasn't. That's probably true.
But what I was saying is I didn't know that we have had this period of not knowing before.
Oh, I had somebody on election night. Actually, it was the next morning. Because you went to sleep that night thinking Trump's got this. And then, between 3 and 4 a.m., thousands of ballots get discovered in all these swing states and urban cities. It was crazy. And they were pronouncing that Joe Biden would be the winner. And someone sent me a photo that had ABC declaring Al Gore as the winner of the presidential election, which they had to then rescind. So we've been here. We've gone through this. Again, it wasn't until December 13th that we knew who would win in the Gore-Bush dynamic, and it took the Supreme Court. And I got a feeling, I'll tell you, especially with Pennsylvania, their crazy governor and their crazier Secretary of State, who's in charge of the elections, all of these mail-in ballots, all of their extending, the collecting, the postmarking, all of the things that they put into place. And this is like this. It ran completely contrary to the state legislature, the actual laws on the books. And if you use 2000 as any examples, the Constitution is clear that it is the role of the state legislator to set voting policy, procedure, law that then has to be carried out by the Secretary of State. They can't write their own rules, even in the midst of a pandemic. And so if the Supreme Court sides, like if they carry forth what the Constitution says and precedent already established as recently as 2000, Pennsylvania will be flipped Trump and he wins. So like
that's insane.
Like
we are
a long way from this happening. And I'll tell you this, and the fact, like, you have all of the mainstream media rushing out telling you Biden won, you're a crazy person if you're asking questions, you're a conspiracy theorist, blah, 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 blah. The same people that spent 3.5 years questioning the last election under the guise of Russian interference that we come to find out was completely cooked up, conspiratorial, was a soft coup. Like, they never respected the 2016 election results. And these are the people that now want us to trust and believe them? I think not. I don't know what's going on, but no, thank you.
No. It's sketchy enough that I'm at the point where I'm like, I've actually taken the break from political stuff. Like this past week, I've watched nothing. I know nothing about what's going on right now. It's been wonderful.
I was telling a brother of mine, because I did the same thing as like beginning on Thursday. So I am a self-proclaimed news junkie. But every junkie at some point hits rock bottom. Where they find themselves in a dark alleyway under a cardboard box, scratching at themselves. They've lost everything. Their teeth have fallen out. And it's in like that moment, if there's any self-awareness, any junkie realizes, like, maybe I have a problem and
I have to change.
and I need to go to rehab to detox. Like, I got to get my life together. I had that kind of a moment last Thursday where I just turned everything off and then, you know, tried to relapse on Monday for about 10 minutes and then immediately turned off Fox News. It was like, I can't handle these people. This is craziness. So the only thing I'm watching is Tucker Carlson right now. And then I'm now watching Newsmax. I'm finding other sources of media where I don't feel compelled to yell at the television. I don't think that that's a really healthy thing.
It is if you're watching like a Vikings-Packers game and the Packers are winning.
Or
and
you're
it's
watching
very healthy to yell at the TV.
Or you're watching the end of Lost and it's that terrible that you J.J. Abrams.
You got to shake your fist. Get off my lawn. All right. We have devolved here.
We have devolved. Well, anyway, I thought it was a good episode.
Agreed.
I hope all of you that have been watching, I hope that you enjoyed your experience. Again, all of the video is archived, so if you ever miss it, you can find it on Facebook and our YouTube page. With all that being said, Creighton, thank you for being with me. Taking time out of your night to run the ship.
Oh, absolutely. It is always a pleasure. Y'all have a wonderful evening.
Flip back over.
Yep, it's all you.
God bless. Love y'all.